Hello, everyone. Welcome in. We're just setting up. All right, so welcome, everyone. We'll wait a couple minutes as people are logging on, but I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Emma Hokoda. I'm an Environmental Programs Associate with the City of Sunnyvale, and I work on the Sustainability Speaker Series event. And with me today from the City of Sunnyvale is Madeline Willette and Albany Nierenberg. And they will just kind of be in the background today helping with our Q&A section, which will be a little bit later on. But they'll just be kind of in the back end working with the questions. So that's those faces that you see. And yeah, we'll give it a couple more minutes to let some people log in. We'll do some polls in a little bit as well to kind of engage with you all and see you. So hang tight for that. Oh, and Madeline, maybe do you want to drop the link for the live stream? Just if people wanna watch on YouTube.
On YouTube, yeah, absolutely.
All right, so let's start out with some polling. So hopefully you all can see this. We just want to know who is joining us this morning to kind of get a feel for our audience. So I'll give you some time to answer this question and then we'll share the results. Okay, let's see. So it looks like we've got a lot of other, as well as students, parents, some facilities staff, architects. That's awesome. It's great to see all of you. Thank you all for coming. And we'll launch into our next poll. All right. So for our next poll, we want to know what percentage of Sunnyvale's greenhouse gas emissions are attributed to buildings emissions. And that's the emissions that buildings produce, not the emissions of building. So take a minute to answer this question. But about 80% of you have voted. If you want to get in your final votes. Okay, let's see. So, all right, it looks like 50% of you said 38%, and you would be correct. It is 38% from buildings, and that includes commercial, industrial gas, and residential gas, as you can see. Sorry, I'll go back. I think I covered that. As you can see, there's 14% from residential gas and 20% from commercial/industrial gas. And that's really important because that's kind of the focus of this talk. Strategy 2 in our climate action playbook is decarbonizing buildings. And within that strategy, there are 3 plays that we use within that strategy. And those 3 are reducing energy consumption in existing buildings, supporting electrification of existing buildings, and achieving all electric new construction. So this is a really important strategy because, as you can see, buildings emissions are the second largest greenhouse gas sector after transportation, which is that 48%. And although Sunnyvale's emissions have decreased since 2008, natural gas use has not. And so decreasing natural gas use in heating, hot water, and cooking will really be critical to achieving our climate neutrality goals. So we've got one final polling question for you all. And that is, what is Sunnyvale's greenhouse gas reduction target by 2030? Right, got 85% votes in. Give you a couple more seconds. Great, okay, let's share these results. Okay, so this was a bit of a trick question. Most of you said 80% below 1990 levels, and then 23% said 56% below 1990 levels. So actually, the answer is 56% below 1990 levels in 2030, but in 2050, we do aim to reach 80% below 1990 levels. If you said 80%, you're on the right track. And currently, we are 25% below our 1990 greenhouse gas emission levels. And our climate action playbook lays out the plan for how we plan to achieve these targets through the 6 key strategies that outline the overarching approach for bold climate action, and 18 plays within these strategies that identify key areas for action and measurable targets, one of which is decarbonizing buildings. And you can check out our climate action playbook and scoreboard online. And Madeline will drop a link in the chat for you all to check out our playbook and our new scoreboard, which keeps us up to date with where we are to reaching our targets. So with that, I will pass it over to Doug Coons, who will be our host for this event. He is the Sustainability Commission Vice Chair for the City of Sunnyvale, and I'll pass it on to Doug.
Thank you very much, Emma, and thank you everyone for joining us for this virtual Sustainability Speaker Series event, Carbon Neutral Portfolio from Vision to Strategy. Some quick background about this event. The Sustainability Speaker Series brings renowned experts in sustainability research and policy development to share their ideas and innovations with our community. The 2020-2021 theme is Playbook Strategies, in line with the City Council's 2019 adoption of the Climate Action Playbook and the Council policy priority of accelerating climate action. This webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to the city's website in the following weeks. Attendees can type their questions into the chat at any point during the event and will be answered during the Q&A session during the last 30 minutes. Questions will not be visible to the audience until they are answered. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. We value your feedback. Please fill out an evaluation form on Google Forms after the event. The link will be posted in the chat. It will also be emailed after the event to those who registered on Eventbrite. Before we begin, local high school student Kaushik Toda will share a few thoughts about youth climate action in schools. Please welcome Kaushik Toda.
Great, thank you so much. Very excited to be here today. And today I'm just going to be sharing some of my perspectives that I've gained as a student who's involved in various efforts within sustainability. So I'm just going to begin with a little bit about myself. Probably like many other peers of mine, I was inspired by former Vice President Al Gore. When I was 11 years old, maybe, I watched one of his many TED Talks, and I was just captivated by his presentational style. And more importantly, I was fascinated by climate change. At the time, it felt like basically no one was talking about this problem that was not only occurring right now, but was worsening at an exponential rate, and with nearly like unanimous consensus within the scientific community that this was a problem that had to be addressed. And so this sort of began my foray into sustainability. And so fast forward 7-ish years, and I'm very lucky to have gotten the opportunity to be involved with many different environmental organizations that are each, taking up the fight against climate change in their own way. So I'm a co-lead within Silicon Valley Youth Climate Action, which is a great local organization that is working on sustainable policy advocacy from the local to state level. We've worked on various kinds of policies, including building electrification codes and legislature at the state level. I'm also the founder and director of operations of the Climate Youth Ambassador Program, which is a nationwide youth-led environmental education organization. And we have nearly 40 ambassadors across 4 different states in the US. And we do different kinds of outreach with various populations, but predominantly elementary and middle school youth. We go to public libraries and set up events. We teach climate science through assemblies at elementary schools and middle schools. And we also do outreach at community gatherings and do various interactive activities to engage the public in critical thought about sustainability. I'm also the president of the Sunnyvale-based Youth Public Policy Institute. This institute is sort of a youth-led think tank supervised by former Sunnyvale Vice Mayor Nancy Smith. And we have different commissions that are focused on different issues that youth care about. So we have commissions on mental health, on climate change, which I'm the chair of, and we also have a commission on improving the quality of life of our district's senior citizens. And so we've worked on policies here, such as building electrification codes or REACH codes in Sunnyvale, the active transportation plan, which was a very crucial plan that was passed in Sunnyvale last year, and various other issues, including public transit. Finally, I'm a youth advisory board member of Green Ninja, which is an environmental textbook company. And it's actually run by San Jose State professor Eugene Cordero, who spoke at a sustainability speaker series event that was conducted by Sunnyvale a couple of years ago, I believe in May of 2019. And that's actually where I met him. So, these kinds of events are a great place for connecting with people. And I'm so happy that the city of Sunnyvale is so proactive with setting up great events like this. And so at that company, I sort of share my perspectives as a student and help to iteratively improve textbook content and make it more engaging and compelling for students to use. As you've probably heard by now, climate action is something that is very important to me, and it's something that's very deeply intertwined into the classroom setting in the initiatives that I work on, at least. So this is an example of an assembly we conducted in San Jose through the Climate Youth Ambassador Program. And we really like going directly to these populations of students. We work directly with elementary school students and middle school students. And, we always go to these schools and bring the content to them. We feel that bringing climate action to the classroom is very important because all students are going to be present there. And so it's a great way to reach a large number of students at one go. And it's also a great environment for teaching this because climate science and climate action ties in very heavily with many different disciplines that are taught in a classroom setting. because sustainability isn't really just one specific thing, right? It's more of sort of an overarching concept. It's something that you can apply to many different disciplines. And so that's something that we try to emphasize through the education that we do in the classroom. Of course, after we instill these values of climate action, of environmental stewardship, we need to provide them with some kind of outlet to connect students directly to the fight against climate change. And from my perspectives, I've dipped my toes in a lot of different sort of disparate spheres within the realm of sustainability. And three of the things that I found most important are science, policy, and connection to local community. So the picture on the right is of me in maybe 8th grade or my freshman year of high school. And I was building a metal air fuel cell. So this was a form of renewable energy that didn't produce any harmful byproducts, and it was also replenishable, inexpensive, and reusable, and portable as well. So scientific innovation is obviously a core aspect of fighting climate change. We need new kinds of energy technology, battery technology, building construction techniques and things of that nature. And so this is one really great outlet for students to utilize their passion for sustainability, scientific innovation. The picture on the left is of me during, I believe, a public comment at the City of Sunnyvale council meeting. And this is another really great place for students to get involved with climate action, working on policies that are near and dear to their heart that they feel will create a big impact on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and resource consumption in their local communities. This is another really great way to mobilize students after we sort of spark their passion for the environment. And finally, another really important component, sort of tied to the aspect of policy advocacy, is just connection to local community, because every community is going to be affected by climate change in some way. So it's really important to bring those issues out and highlight them so students will feel the need to really get involved because it's impacting them personally. So those are a few of the things that I found have been really helpful and really great opportunities for students such as myself to get involved in climate action. And of course, I can't conduct this presentation without plugging a few of these amazing organizations. So these are the websites. Feel free to take a screenshot. I believe the recording of this will go up later as well, so you can just go back to this slide and check us out. The Climate Youth Ambassador Program is focused on environmental education. As I said, both Silicon Valley Youth Climate Action and the Youth Public Policy Institute are focused on policy advocacy predominantly, and Green Ninja is an environmental textbook company. So I know there's some students, some parents, and some teachers in here, so I urge you to utilize these resources and recommend them to your students or peers, because they're great places to get involved with climate action and fighting climate change if you're interested in doing so. But yeah, I believe that's everything. Again, thank you so much for having me, and hopefully you gained a little bit from this perspective.
Thank you, Kaushik, for your commitment to climate action and for the inspiring example that you are setting. And now I'd like to introduce Nik Kaestner. Nik Kaestner is currently on leave from his role as the first Director of Sustainability at the San Francisco Unified School District, or SFUSD. At the district's 180 sites, Nik and his staff of 5 have kept busy promoting energy efficiency, water conservation, waste reduction, green schoolyards, and low-carbon transportation. Since Nik's hire in 2008, SFUSD's energy use has dropped by 22%, water usage has decreased by 29%, and waste diversion has doubled to 66%. SFUSD has been recognized as a Green Ribbon District by the U.S. Department of Education. SFUSD also received the Best of Green Schools Award for Industry Transformation from the U.S. Green Building Council's Center for Green Schools. Please welcome Nik Kaestner. Nik, you're on mute.
Good thing I was on mute earlier. Hello, everyone from Germany. I'm spending the year here with my family. and I was just saying that I'm excited to be speaking to a Silicon Valley crowd, which doesn't happen that often. I guess our peninsula is a lot longer than I thought. But I want to share with you a little bit about SFUSD's decarbonization plan, or a zero net energy plan. SFUSD is the 7th largest, if we can get the slide to change, try again. SFUSD is 7th largest school district in California. As you know, it's dense and urban. We've got about 55,000 students. They tend to be very diverse, low-income students. On the flip side, we have a lot of wealthy and supportive voters. And unfortunately, a lot of their kids, while they vote for public schools, their kids tend to go to private schools. I think we have one of the highest shares of private school enrollment in California. But as you know, in California, we've had for some time some very bold leadership. And California has committed itself to many ambitious goals. Among them, the desire to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 40% below 1990 levels by the year 2030. We've already reached our 2020 goal, which is why I'm kind of blowing right past that one. But one point I wanted to make is that in a business as usual case, which is shown in blue, that's kind of the trajectory we're currently on, our emissions in California will actually start rising again by 2030. And so it's very important that California takes aggressive action right now to bend that curve downward. This was a study that was done at Berkeley Labs, and they determined that only the most aggressive action would let us as a state meet that 2030 goal. So we all need to be very ambitious in the next 10 years. San Francisco has had some ambitious goals for a while. Sorry, but the slides are changing very slowly across the Atlantic. San Francisco set itself the goal of being 40% below 5 years earlier than the state. That's largely because we were able to shut down a power plant within city borders. And so that helped us to reduce our emissions quite dramatically already. I think we're below 25% below 1990 at this point, and has the same goal as Sunnyvale of 80% reduction by 2050. At the state level, the way to reach those ambitious targets, well, there's many ways to reach the targets, as you can see on this slide, but the one I'm going to focus on the most right now is the need to double the energy efficiency savings in existing buildings. And that's particularly relevant for San Francisco because, as you'll see shortly, SF Unified has a lot of existing buildings and we're not building that many new ones. The thing is, the goals for new construction are fairly straightforward. Basically, the state wants to make sure that all new buildings built by the year 2030 will be net zero energy. So they will not use any net energy over the course of a year. And that is pretty easy to do. Net zero energy, for those of you that don't know, essentially means that all the energy uses over the course of the year, whether it's heating or lighting, equipment, things you plug into the wall, or even hot water, all of those can be zeroed out by renewable energy on the roof or on your property. And there are many examples across the United States of zero net energy schools that are brand new. And that's because with a brand new building, you have a lot of ability to control everything from the building envelope to give the building a lot of insulation, to the kinds of pumps that you install, to using LED lighting, et cetera. So it's not that big of a challenge to get to zero net energy with a new building. The problem is that our schools, oh, sorry, I was gonna make one more point. In California, the energy use of a new building is controlled by the building code. And so California has decided that in the next 10 years, it's simply going to ratchet up or ratchet down the building code to the point where a new building does not use any net energy over the course of the year. So there's a very clear path for how we deal with new construction. But San Francisco has a lot of old buildings, as you can see in these photos. A lot of them have concrete walls with no insulation. So we were a little nervous that meeting the state's goals could be somewhat difficult. And as you can see on this slide, if it ever loads, the state's goals for existing buildings are a lot more aggressive. because we don't have this 10-year time frame to kind of get ready. For existing buildings, the goal is that half of them will be retrofit to be zero net energy buildings in the next 10 years. Just imagine how many millions and millions of buildings are in California. The hope, basically, is that 50% of building owners will figure out a way, either the financing or the contractors, to help make that work. And right now, I think California is not really on the trajectory to make that happen. But we at the district decided we would make that our goal after we had a little panic attack. And so we began to attend a lot of seminars and try to educate ourselves on how in the world we could get to that ambitious goal. I'm wondering whether, well, I'll just keep going. I think some of the hidden slides Emma are showing, but we'll just keep going and see how it goes. So we toured the Berkeley Public Library, which was designed to be zero net energy ready. We took part in the 7x7x7 challenge, in which the state architect surveyed 7 different buildings and hired 7 architects to come up with zero net energy plans for those buildings to see if it was feasible. Bottom line, even for existing buildings like this old one in Santa Barbara, which is very similar to San Francisco construction, it was possible for us to get to zero net energy. We decided to take a look at how we as a district were doing. I've always been a very big believer in looking at data to inform any future decisions. And as you can see on this slide, during our modernization, a lot of the buildings did get more efficient during our past modernizations. So the light purple bars show you how much energy all of our schools in that previous bond were using. The dark purple show you how much energy was used after we were done renovating them. And in the top half of this graph, those schools were ones in which the energy use dropped, sometimes quite dramatically so, by over 50%. The problem is, of course, that the ones in the bottom half of the graph did not actually increase their energy during our modernization projects. And that could be because we added new equipment like electronic whiteboards, or maybe we had to increase the amount of heating because teachers complained that it was too cold in the buildings, or we added air conditioning because it was too hot. So there's a variety of reasons. But the bottom line is there was no consistent trend. So our modernization projects don't necessarily become more efficient, which is obviously not what we want to see. Then we thought, well, surely our new schools have to be doing better. This was one of the few new schools we have built, Willie Brown Middle School. And we took a look at the energy use for this school, which will hopefully load shortly. Let's try it again. And as you can see, Willie Brown is among the more efficient schools that we have in the district. But you would expect no less since it's a brand new school and most of the other ones were built 80 to 100 years ago. But it is not the most efficient, which was somewhat concerning on the heating side. But then we looked at the electricity use of Willie Brown. And as you can see, it actually used more electricity than any of our other middle schools. And even after you include the solar panels that we activated about a year after construction, it still was only the second most efficient electric school in the district. That most efficient school there was built in the 1920s. So clearly we were not on the right path, neither with our modernization projects or by building a code compliant new building that meets all of the modern standards. Well, there's a lot of people that would be very upset to hear this, and many of them made their voices known in the past couple of years. And I'm very excited that our students, not just in San Francisco, but all across the globe, have really tried to put the fire under our efforts to ensure that we don't accept the status quo, but instead we work to make things better. I particularly love this quote. I'm also afraid for my job. So here's what we decided to do in San Francisco. First of all, we had to explain to people that zero net energy is actually a feasible concept. If you tell most project managers, I want you to make your buildings use no energy over the course of the year, I think most of them would have laughed or would have commented on how expensive it was. So we invited some architects to share some of their zero net energy stories so that our project managers and our administration, our building administration, knew that it was a feasible task. We also got together our brightest minds in a Zero Net Energy working group to start to talk about which technologies we would find acceptable and which technologies we might want to steer away from. We also talked to other districts that had similar ambitious goals, the most respected of which, in my opinion, was Boulder Valley School District. They've had sustainability management systems and energy goals since 2009, way before we started looking at this. And they also have a zero net energy goal for their building stock. We went to visit a bunch of zero net energy buildings in the Bay Area. This is the Zero Net Energy Training Center, which is owned by the Electrical Union. It's a place where electricians can practice fixing and working with wind turbines, solar panels, efficient heating systems, etc. And we went to visit this elementary school in Campbell Union School District in San Jose, which was designed to meet zero net energy standards. At this point, a report had also just come out from the Department of Energy that looked at how efficient buildings should be in different climate zones in the United States before you start thinking about adding renewable energy. In other words, it pays to be more efficient first, and then to cover your remaining energy needs with renewable energy. So as you can see, San Francisco, because we have a very mild climate, we actually had the lowest energy use that we should be targeting of all the climate zones. Fairbanks, Alaska, obviously was given a little bit of a pass. They were allowed to use a lot more energy because it just costs a lot of money. It costs more money to get a school to be super efficient in Alaska, where it's very cold, than it does in San Francisco. So that became our EUI goal, our energy use intensity goal, which is just a way of measuring how energy efficient a building is per square foot. We also had to talk a lot about technology because most of our schools, like schools in East Coast big cities like Boston or DC, they were still heated by these massive boilers that generate steam, and that steam runs through our building, kind of like in New York and Boston. And basically, it's a very different technology than would be installed nowadays. So our buildings and grounds shop was very concerned that by switching to these modern technologies, that their staff would not be able to service the new heating systems. And we'll get back to that a little bit later. We also recognize that several studies have shown that natural gas as a fuel is, while it may be cleaner than coal, is not really a great transition fuel for a couple of reasons. One, if I put in something that's powered by natural gas, I'm probably still going to have it 20 years from now, which makes it very difficult for the school district to eliminate its carbon emissions. The other problem is that natural gas is leaking from pipes all throughout the United States. Oh, now it just advanced by itself. So that obviously means that while we think natural gas is a cleaner burning fuel, methane is being emitted into the atmosphere. And that in turn means that natural gas, according to some estimates, is almost as bad as coal. The other thing that we have going for us in San Francisco is that we have a utilities commission. In other words, we have our own little city utility that provides us with very inexpensive electricity. So that was another reason for us to stay away from natural gas in our new heating systems and to focus more on electric heating. Let's see if we can get it to switch again. There we go. On the flip side, and I shouldn't have called this utility perk, on the flip side, because we have very cheap electric utility rates, solar power doesn't make sense in San Francisco the way it does in many other districts across California. School districts have been one of the primary initial places where these huge solar PV arrays were being installed on carports like this one, or even on fields or on rooftops. But that's something we haven't been able to take advantage of because we would actually pay more than our current electricity bill, whereas other districts are generally paying less than they pay to PG&E or other utility providers. One additional lesson learned as part of this research process, we asked a couple firms to do some energy analyses of the buildings that were about to go under modernization. What they did, you can see on this graph, is they looked at the different technologies along the bottom here and what impact they would have on the energy use of a building. So this is called an energy model. It allows engineers to predict the energy use based on different elements that you might include or not include in your building. So I'm not going to go over every single one, but I want to point out the two major technologies that we discovered needed to go into our new buildings. And generally, this is true for all buildings across California. The first is LED lights. You can see that the energy use of the building would go from an EUI, an energy use intensity of 35, to an energy use intensity of 30. That was a pretty big drop just from replacing the lighting in our buildings from fluorescent to LED. Then there were a bunch of other technologies that might give us a marginal benefit. Then the other main one was, in fact, to switch to heat pumps. And heat pumps are modern technology that San Francisco has also discovered is crucial for meeting its 2050 goals. Actually, you can see down here, there's a bunch of technologies that San Francisco needs to use in order to get down to an 80% reduction. But the last step is to use electric heat pumps down at the bottom right here. So forgot I made that circle. So what is a heat pump? If you've gone to Tahoe, you know what electric resistance heating is. Many older buildings, especially cabins, have these little resistance baseboard heaters. And when you turn them on, a little coil starts glowing and produces heat. Unfortunately, that heat comes at a big price because it's not very efficient. And so many people try to avoid that kind of heat for their regular homes where they don't spend just a few days every year. A heat pump uses electric heat, but it's using the electricity not to generate the heat, but rather to pull the heat out of the outside air. So you can see by these yellow dots, and it concentrates the heat inside your building, as you can see by these red dots. So in a way, this is kind of like a refrigerator working backwards. A refrigerator also contains a heat pump, but it's taking the heat from from inside the refrigerator, and it dumps it into your kitchen. Most of you may not know that because often the refrigerator puts the heat behind, like the coils for the refrigerator are behind the refrigerator. But some modern ones will get warm to the touch on the side, or you'll feel heat coming out from underneath. That's a sign that the heat inside the fridge is coming out. So what a heat pump does for a building is the exact opposite. It actually pulls the heat from outside into the building. If you were in Tahoe or on the East Coast, you would generally speaking, or Minneapolis for that matter, you probably would actually try to take the heat out of the earth instead of out of the air, because the air in Minneapolis could be very cold in the winter, and so there's not that much heat there. But in California, that's something we don't need to usually worry about, because even if it gets down to freezing, the molecules are still moving and there's still some heat that we can generate. I'm going to skip over the slide because it doesn't apply, as I said, to our climate zones. So I think this is my final slide about kind of our preparation process. So one of the things we discovered is we wanted to kind of be smart about how we stage these different improvements in our buildings. And so the first thing we did, we're just calling it kind of quality control or Kaizen, is doing all the data analysis, the reports, the kind of the background research. Then we decided our first thing we're going to do, because it's a slam dunk for buildings and grounds, and it's a slam dunk for energy savings, is to replace LED lighting. Because LED lighting lasts longer, which means it doesn't have to be replaced as much, and that's a win-win for everybody involved. Then we would focus on envelope improvements, so windows, insulation, new roof, etc. Because once again, those are things that if we fix them up, they don't lead to any extra work and any retraining of our staff. And only where necessary do we start thinking about switching our heating systems, because we know that we'd like to bring on new qualified repairmen, buildings and grounds staff members, and it'll take some time for them to have the ability to manage these new electric heating sources. So this was our kind of our staged plan for becoming more efficient. Now, I know there's not that many of you on the call, but some of you in school facilities are probably wondering, well, how are you going to pay for all of this? There are many ways that schools can, many funding sources that are available. Not all of them are huge. The main way, though, that we fund schools in California is that we ask voters to pay for bonds. So since that's where most of the money is, we decided that's the money trail that we had to follow as well. But we also wanted to be smart about how we spend this money. So we decided to focus on replacing things where they were already broken and not necessarily switching to these new technologies immediately. And the reason is, if I were to replace a heating system, shown here on the far left, like a new electric heat pump, I need an outdoor unit, I need some indoor units, I need controllers, I need new wiring. All of that costs quite a bit of money. So if I were to rip out a perfectly functional natural gas-based system or a steam-based system, I'm going to be spending a lot of money to replace something that works. And Buildings and Grounds was not too happy about that, rightfully so. So instead, what we decided to do is we would only pay for these replacements if we had to replace the boiler anyway, if we were going to be putting in a new heating system because the old one was on its last legs. Because what that means is that the cost of that new boiler, we're going to have to spend anyway. And so the extra cost of putting in this new electric heating was kept at a fairly reasonable level. But nevertheless, we still had financial battles because there are kind of two ways of looking at finances in schools. On the one hand, there was our director of the school bond, and he wanted to make sure that the bond money was spread to as many schools as possible, because that's one way that we show love for our schools, so to speak. On the flip side was our chief fiscal officer, who's responsible for the operating costs, not the construction, but just how we operate our schools on a day-to-day basis. She really wanted us to follow zero net energy approach because she wanted to make sure that her utility bills would be lower in perpetuity. So this battle wasn't, generally resolved as follows. Basically, we decided that all new schools would be made Zini ready effective immediately, which means that we were going to build them to be able to use no energy over the course of the year. But because we don't have the financial incentive for putting renewables on our roof yet, we will put off that installation by 5 or so years, however long it takes for the solar panels to become even cheaper than they are today. During modernization projects, we're only going to replace systems that need to be replaced anyway. So what that might mean is, if I've got a building where the heating system is crap, but the windows have been replaced 5 years ago, then we will focus our energy on getting a zero net energy compliant heating system, but we won't touch the windows this time around, with the understanding that probably 15 or 20 years from now, there will be another bond, and that bond will probably go back to that same school and make additional fixes. And as I just mentioned, we decided to punt on renewables until such time as we can get a better deal that's actually cheaper than the energy we're paying now. We summarized all of this in a carbon reduction plan. Originally, the plan was to go to the school board first and get approval, but because we didn't have a superintendent during this time, we decided to go ahead and produce the plan, as you see on the left. And then we went to the school board later and said, look, we've already thought about this. We've covered all our bases. We've talked to everybody who's involved and who might be a stakeholder. And we've got a plan that we think will get us there. And that actually made it very easy to bring the school board on board. Excuse the pun. I'm not going to go over all the details of our plan because I think I don't want to take too long, but I put it in the slideshow in case you want to look at it later. Now, as many of you know, putting together a plan is nice. It takes a lot of work, but it doesn't necessarily mean that things are going to change. Execution is just as important as coming up with a good strategy. So I'm just going to whip through the ways in which we make sure that this policy is actually implemented. The most important thing we realized is that we needed to be able to give architects something that explained our thinking and our goals. And so we put together these project requirements. They're only 8 pages long. And they basically lay out how we're going to finance our projects, how we want our architects to design them. They explain the process we will use during design to make sure that energy considerations are included. They also talk about what we're going to do for new buildings and what we're going to do for modernization projects. You can see our little staircase there at the bottom right. We put together a checklist that actually explains which items are mandatory during modernizations, like the LED lighting that I talked about earlier, and which types of improvements we're only going to do if that piece of equipment is in need of replacement. And then in the final section, we have our Zini Guidelines, which go building system by building system to explain what kinds of technologies are okay with us and which kinds of technologies we'd rather avoid, usually because of our concern about maintenance. Another element was to update our design standards. Not all districts have design standards, but in case they do, it's nice to go through those and just make sure that they don't conflict with what you've just put down in the design guidelines to architects. But even after giving them all that, we still decided you always need to look, make sure that the architects are following orders, so to speak, not because they don't have the best of intentions, but some aren't as trained on these technologies as others, and some just don't have the experience. So in buildings, there's a process called commissioning, in which you make sure that you bring in a third party to take a look at how the buildings are designed and make sure that the proper design then ends up in the actual building. For example, we had one architect came back to us and suggested that we put in a new efficient gas boiler, because clearly this architect had not read our design guidelines. So our commissioning agent caught that mistake and made sure that we were made aware of it even before we had noticed it. And that allowed us to prevent a climate catastrophe in that particular school. So again, that process is called commissioning, and the goal is just to be a second set of eyes when I'm not available. So in theory, at this point, we thought we'd had it all figured out and things were going to go honky-dory. But as you know, in San Francisco, the road is not always straight. And so we did run into some hurdles. I'm not going to do a play-by-play, but remember that staircase I showed you? The reality is, in our first bond after implementing our Zini standards, we found out that we had a lot of heating systems that need to be replaced, which from a carbon standpoint was great, because now we were actually tackling the biggest carbon producer in our buildings. But remember that Buildings and Grounds was very nervous about seeing all these heat pumps go into buildings. So we had some tense meetings during this time where we tried to figure out how we could stay true to our plan, but comfort Buildings and Grounds and make sure that we had the resources in place to train them properly, so that those new technologies were maintainable in the future. So where are we now? We, as part of this most recent bond, we are putting in 4 new buildings. The one on the bottom right, I think, has actually been built already, and the kids have moved in. So these are buildings that didn't exist yet. As I said before, these were made zero energy compliant and are using electricity as we speak. We also modernized a lot of buildings, but 4 buildings have had their natural gas hookups disconnected, and they are now or will soon be operating on electric heat pumps. And when we were looking at buildings, we decided that is the biggest slice of the pie, but about a third of our emissions actually come from vehicle fuels. So while I won't go into detail here, I will just mention that we also gave each one of our teachers a brand new Tesla. But seriously, we started dabbling in electric vehicles. Most of our fleet is actually in the Buildings and Grounds department. So we experimented with some electric vans. One funny story happened when we tried to go up a San Francisco hill with electric van, and we actually got stuck halfway up. So we called the manufacturer and we said, well, this isn't going to work for San Francisco. And we thought we would have to wait another 5 years till the technology was ripe. But it turns out, just like a Tesla, these vans could be updated over the air. And the manufacturer, in the interest of expanding the range, had just restricted the amount of power available to this particular van, because in most markets, you don't need to go up San Francisco hills. So after we tried it again 2 days later with the update in place, we had no problem climbing the hills. And we're now exploring ways in which we can start bringing these vans into the San Francisco district fleet. In the meantime, we did start smaller. There's some fantastic rebates out there for local governments and school districts to upgrade their municipal fleets, their light duty vehicles, as these small vehicles tend to be called. And so we've bought our first plug-in vehicle a couple of years ago, and everybody's very thrilled with that, because the cost of maintenance and the cost to fuel them has been extremely low. And then, just like the city of San Francisco, we decided to look into renewable diesel to power our current bus fleet. which we don't own ourselves. So it's been a bit of a challenge to try to get our fleet operator to switch to renewable fuels. They actually wanted us to send them a sample of the fuel to their headquarters in Ohio. They tested it, it came back fine, but then they still dragged their feet when we wanted to convert. So now we've actually started working with a vendor who's going to start implementing some electric vehicles for our local bus service, and are excited to kind of just jump right past renewable diesel to the end goal, which is, of course, to electrify everything. So in summary, important thing for decarbonization is to create a framework that includes stakeholders. It's important to have very clear energy targets and to share those targets with everyone involved, from architects to stakeholders within the organization. It's important to consider your utility rates. If you've got expensive electricity right now, you could be going gangbusters on PV power, and you could be powering those electric heating systems yourself with the power on your rooftop. San Francisco isn't there yet, but I think in Silicon Valley, you probably could get there sooner. It's important to check the work of our designers, of your designers, to make sure that everyone is on board and that we're not, that your goals are not being accidentally voided by a lack of attention. And it's important to be ambitious, definitely. The climate crisis demands it, but also to be pragmatic, because there are going to be stakeholders or financial considerations that will require that you maybe delay one part of your plan or focus on one thing and pick up something else later. But then the most important thing, of course, is to be persistent and flexible so that you can reach that goal by, in our case, 2040. So I think that's it from me. So I will pass it back over to Emma. Thank you for listening, and I hope you learned something.
Emma, are you
Hello,
there?
all right. Yeah, sorry about that. Great. Okay, thank you so much, Nick, for that discussion. That was really awesome. So now we have our Q&A session. And some of you have already been typing your questions into the Q&A box. That's awesome. And so I'll just start from the ones you've already received. Feel free to type in any more questions as they come up. And if you would like to ask a question verbally, there's a raise hand function that you can use. And so we can unmute you for that if you would prefer. We do ask that if you do choose to speak, that you don't take more than 30 seconds, just so we can get through all the questions in a timely manner. But to start, I'll start with some of the questions that we already have received. So the first question we have is, will there be energy storage requirements in commercial and public buildings to enable the integration of more renewable energy into the electric grid?
Is this for me or for you?
I think this is for you.
Okay. I will say that California is definitely supporting energy storage. So that, let's just get that out of the way. There's a big emphasis on providing incentives for locations in the state that might experience grid outages. So that program, which kind of used to be open for everybody, has shifted very strongly towards supporting people in fire-prone areas, for example. But there's also a bill that I think may have just passed. I've been obviously not keeping track of California politics quite as diligently as I was before, but there was a bill to ensure that schools in fire zones in particular also get battery storage incentives. So I think that may have passed, which means that schools are also in a prime position to take advantage of some of those incentives. But generally speaking, batteries make sense. They make a little less sense for schools because we tend to use energy during the middle of the day. And so we tend to be open when we're also producing power. So it's not quite as bad as a home setting, a residential setting, where people, let's say you had a multifamily building and you've got a PV system on the roof and people are at work during the day. That PV system is producing power and it's being sent into the grid. Then people come home at night, they all start cooking in this all electric building. but there's no sun shining anymore. And so all that power is now coming from the grid, whatever happens to be produced. So in that kind of a situation, batteries make a lot more sense. And I think the state would definitely want to continue to incentivize batteries in that particular setting. Doesn't mean it doesn't make sense for schools, it's just slightly less beneficial.
Gotcha, great, thank you for answering that. There's a quick question about the districts that were role models for SFUSD. I think that was on a slide. If you could just rename those districts.
Yeah, the big role model was Boulder Valley Unified School District. I think it's BVUSD. There are others that are doing stuff, but those guys were really on top of their game.
Great. Okay. Let's see. So we have another question about funding for retrofitting and where that funding comes from. Is it split between like local government, state government, and would poor communities that might not be as wealthy as San Francisco or Sunnyvale be left out?
So there's I think two main places that at least San Francisco gets funding, and I think it's the same for many school districts. Bonds is, when you ask a voter to essentially pay taxes for the next 10 years in order to fund school construction. And you're right that lower income communities sometimes have trouble passing bonds because their voters are not in a position to spend money on schools, because they have their own financial concerns. And then the other place is developer fees. So in San Francisco and many other cities, when you build a new construction project, you also have to pay a fee to the city because of the increased services that will be required because of the people that are going to be living in the building you're building. So in San Francisco, for example, you pay money to schools, and I'm sure you pay money to the utility departments, et cetera, to basically hook up your building and provide schooling and education for the kids that move into that building. So, so that's the second way. I know, and then another way is that schools, the state will pass bonds and give that money to school districts to help them construct their own buildings. So that last one is really important because there's been a big equity concern expressed over the last few years, and school funding from the state will increasingly be directed towards schools that can't pass their own bonds. So hopefully that will help to even the playing field.
Yeah, that's great. That's good news. Okay, so we have a question about ZNE versus zero net greenhouse gas emissions. Mm-hmm. So do you think that there needs to be a policy realignment to zero net emissions versus zero net greenhouse gas emissions?
I realized I didn't explain it clearly. In San Francisco, there doesn't need to be, but I think in general, people should be passing zero net carbon policies. Our electricity comes from the Hetch Hetchy power system, which is owned by the city of San Francisco. It's basically a hydroelectric plant that's existed for, I think, almost exactly 100 years. And so our power has been greenhouse gas neutral since we've gotten it. That obviously won't be true for most districts around the state. So yes, in general, I think realigning around zero net carbon is important. And I will also say that from a state conversation perspective, that Z&E was kind of the thing for 2 years, and already we've pivoted to zero net carbon. So at almost all conferences, all discussions are around zero net carbon now, and people are realizing that sometimes batteries will help you achieve that. Sometimes you need to think about other energy sources. But in our particular case, zero net energy and zero net carbon end up being the same thing. If I electrify my entire building stock, we will be Z&C. But thank you for bringing that up because it's very important.
Great. Well, thank you for clarifying that. So we have another question about that zero emission plan that you shared that you wrote for SFUSD. Is that publicly available? Yes,
I believe we have, I'm 99% sure it's on the SFUSD website. So you just go to sfusd.edu, like education, /sustainability. And you'll see all of the sustainability programs, and this one will be under energy.
Perfect. All right, so there's another question asking you to comment a bit more about renewable energy's role in carbon neutrality and zero net energy. Is renewable energy for renewable energy's sake and not necessarily a worthwhile approach to act on climate?
Well, I mean, without renewable energy, we're not going to get there. I think I'm going to kind of focus again on the building side of things. So, because the state obviously needs to ensure that we can have renewable energy at every minute of the day during every season of the year. which is not something that we can guarantee right now, even in California. But in terms of kind of the organizational level, I like to think of our responsibility as trying to be a good citizen of the grid. So if we can generate our own power, so we don't need to draw energy from the grid, both during the summer when it's convenient and in the winter when it's more difficult to do so, then I think we will have accomplished our mission as kind of a responsible stakeholder going forward. But that means that without renewables, we're not going to get there. I think there are some situations where a particular organization might find it more efficient or more useful to focus on efficiency, just to make the building as efficient as possible, because they're not in a good position to generate renewables. Maybe because there's a lot of trees around, or they're in a valley, and so the sun doesn't really shine on the roof for long periods of time. But generally speaking, the formula is reduce the amount of energy you use, cover that energy with renewables, and get as close to zero net energy and zero net carbon as you can.
Great. So our next question is, you mentioned that the SF utility offers very cheap electricity. And there's a question about how carbon intensive that SF utility electricity portfolio is.
Yeah, so that was kind of covered when I commented on the fact that we get all hydroelectric power. That's the reason it's so cheap, is because that dam was constructed 100 years ago. And so besides maintenance costs, the city doesn't have to spend a lot of money to produce the electricity. And so we benefit from that. But there are other places in the country that also have cheap electricity. Often it's because they have nuclear power plants that have been chugging for the last few decades. But our electricity is carbon free.
Great. So we have a question asking if you do any other talks like this or information sharing with other districts so that they can also benefit from the work that you've done.
Great question. There is a group called there's an event called the Sustainability Leaders Summit that is put on by the U.S. Green Building Council. And they are kind of the premier green building organization in the United States. And at this summit, school sustainability leaders like myself get together to discuss best practices, motivate each other, and continue to learn from what's going on around the country. So that's one place, and I definitely encourage you to look up the Center for Green Schools, where you can learn more about the USGBC. The other place is the Green Schools Summit, which is essentially, it happens right after the Leaders Summit I was just talking about. And that's a collaborative effort between the USGBC and I can't remember the other organization, but that is the kind of premier nationwide summit for green schools. In California, we also have a smaller event that's taking place in Pasadena the last few years. That's called the Green Schools and Community College Summit or something like that, or the Green California Schools Summit. The wording is also very important, but I'm sure you could Google it pretty quickly. And I've actually found that one to be useful. It's much smaller, but it's very California focused. So there'll be a lot of this, a lot of conversations that relate directly to your particular school district.
Awesome, great. Thank you for sharing that information. So we have a question about wondering if there's state or Bay Area Quality Management District funding for schools to install heat pumps or switch to natural gas to electric sources for HVAC.
Let me say, well, not that I know of, more and more communities are providing incentives for individual homeowners to do that. Usually the state as a whole, in fact, a former colleague of mine who used to work in the SFUSD Sustainability Office is working on a program that I think either launched or was about to launch that provides incentives for hot water heaters to go heat pump in the residential setting, and maybe even in school setting. I think there's some money put aside for schools. But whether we will soon have that similar kind of incentive program for heating systems, I don't know. I imagine the state will go there in the next few years because a lot of people will need some upfront funding to make that switch. As I mentioned in my slideshow, it's a lot easier just to replace a piece of the puzzle rather than to completely throw out the old heating system to put in a new one. But just as it took a big effort to get people on the moon, it's going to take a big effort to get everybody to switch out their old fossil fuel heating systems. So to be determined.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. There's kind of another question similar about cost benefit analysis of considering everything else being equal, is it cheaper to tear down an old building and build a new one with new resources, or modernize and retrofit it?
Wow, these are great questions. Very savvy audience. We struggled with that for a while, and we basically came to the conclusion, based on a lot of the studies that have been done, that if you can keep an existing building, the amount of carbon you will save in materials that you would otherwise have to procure, basically manufacture, transport, assemble, and all that stuff is, let's say 99 out of 100 or 90 out of 100 times, it's better to go that route. If you were in a really cold climate, it might make sense. Maybe it's too tough to upgrade the envelope of your building. But generally speaking, if there's a way to salvage the building, that's the way to go. That doesn't mean that you don't, rip off the skin and insulate it really well from the outside if you're in Lake Tahoe, for example. But a lot of times, because these new systems are so efficient, whether we're talking about the heat pumps or because solar is so cheap for most of us, it just doesn't make sense to make the building that much more efficient when you could just put a few more solar panels on the roof to cover that energy waste. So that's why, especially in our mild climate in California, if you can keep a building, I think that is definitely the better carbon way to go, since we're speaking about carbon.
Gotcha. Great. Well, speaking of solar panels, someone wants to know if schools can actually make money from putting solar panels on the roof. This individual says that SVCE allows him to make money from his solar panels.
I guess make money versus save over business as usual is, in a way, kind of the same thing. So I'm kind of hesitating because in Germany, where I am right now, solar was definitely and is still viewed kind of as a way to make money, and it used to be that you didn't even have to reduce your own utility bill in order to make money. I'm not in California. That's generally true for schools. I think the way that you save money in California would be you install the solar. You take, usually because school districts don't want to pay for it up front, they would do what's called a power purchase. So you basically agree to have somebody install solar panels on your roof, and you buy the power that is generated from those solar panels at a rate that is lower than the rate of the energy you're currently paying to your utility company. So instead of paying maybe 22 cents per kilowatt hour, now you're only paying 19 cents. And unlike the utility rate, which will go up a few cents every year, every 2 years, the rate that you negotiate with this PV company will be flat for the 20 or 25 years that you negotiate. So as you can tell, over time, you're going to be making money compared to what you would have paid before. So that's what most schools are doing that don't want to pay for the panels up front. I know that some schools do want to own the panels, which also means you have to maintain them. And so they will tend to use bond money to buy the panels so they belong to the school district. And then at that point, from an operations side of the, remember I was talking about the two financial considerations. From the point of view of the chief financial officer, if the bond is paying for the panels, then the financial officer who's just concerned with operations views the solar panels as a cash cow that's providing money. So yeah, that would be, depending on how you slice and dice it, you could view solar panels as income.
Yeah, interesting. Gotcha. Thank you for answering that. All right, so the next question is, what would you say is the most important lesson you learned about the ongoing role of maintenance professionals, both at the outset and once installed, when it comes to zero net energy?
Just crucial. I think one of the things that I am happy we did is to include the maintenance staff in our initial discussions when things went, I won't say they went south, let's say when they went west, and we discovered we were installing more heating systems than we had initially thought we would, and buildings and grounds started getting nervous. I'm glad that we reached out to them and said we need to have a big powwow to discuss this, because that this was not the intent of the plan, to kind of overwhelm you with new technology all at once. So I can just only encourage all of you to please respect the needs and wishes of the maintenance department. I forgot to mention, I really should, if you email me, Emma, I can send it to you, but we actually came up with, we had a powwow, as I mentioned, and we came up with a second set of guidance which explained which kinds of electric technologies we were happy with and when we would decide to not replace the heating system. That was very much based on the needs of our Buildings and Grounds department. So that document is another, like a supplement that we gave our architects so that they understood just because our goal is to replace everything doesn't mean we want to do it like today. So, it's a very, all I can say is treat them with respect and make sure that maintenance is part of the conversation. It is so crucial.
Great. Yeah, that would be a great resource to provide. So the next question is, how painful and expensive is it to rip out a natural gas forced air heating system for a commercial building and replace it with electric heat pumps? This person is the board of a church that consumes a lot of natural gas for heating large spaces every year.
Okay, there are, I didn't want to get wonky with you all, but I'm going to, because it sounds like this person might know what I'm talking about. So there are two ways to electrify heating. One is called a VRF system. These are highly efficient. They were initially made in Southeast Asia, although many of them now come from the United States as well. And the nice thing about a VRF system, it's called variable refrigerant flow, is that you have a little box on your roof usually, and you have a little box inside your rooms. And if heat needs to be pulled out of your rooms, the system pulls the heat out and dumps it into the air outside the building, like I showed you. And if you need to get heat in the winter, it scavenges heat from outside and dumps it into your room. So those are extremely efficient. You can even hook it up so that if one room is too hot and one room is too cold, you can take heat from one room and put it in the other. So you don't even waste any heat to the environment. Totally amazing. But they're a lot more complicated than just replacing your air conditioning with a heat pump that can both heat and cool your building and use the existing ductwork that's already there. So in many cases, especially for fairly efficient buildings, even though they're not quite as efficient, I've seen studies that show that it makes sense because of the costs to stick with a heat pump, an all-in-one unit, rather than to go with a VRF system. So if in this church if you've already got the ductwork and you have air conditioning, you could actually, either when the air conditioning breaks or if you want to do it now for carbon reasons, you could just replace that box with a heat pump and you can heat and cool your building without having to do any kind of upgrade to the interior of your building. So hopefully that will be a good solution for some of you that are worried about the cost of retrofitting the building entirely. For new construction, I would go with the VRF because you'll be doing everything from scratch anyway.
Great, thank you. I'm sure that was super helpful for that person. So we have someone who has raised their hand, so I'm going to invite them to ask their question verbally. So Alice, you should be able to speak.
Alice.
Hey, Nick, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm great. I miss you.
I miss you.
Okay, so a couple of quick follow-up questions. Sorry about this. Nick and I are old friends from way back, thick in the sustainability school space. So quick question, who can we follow up now with more detailed questions about the energy performance? And I realize the complicating factor is that the schools have not been occupied this last year.
I know.
But you know, at some point they will be, and you know, maybe there was a little bit of data before we closed down in March. But who can we follow up with for more questions about the energy performance of those, at least those 4 modernizations that where you decarbonize and replace with heat pumps, both for cost savings, first cost savings, and then any performance measured, you know, ongoing use cost savings and carbon. Who's been tracking that since you've been gone?
Well, I mean, even when I was there, I was not tracking data. I was kind of getting reports on data when, you know, as necessary. Right. So I would say, you know, Amy Chan in my office does that. Whether she was very heavily involved in shutting down natural gas heating systems across the district when we went into lockdown, because as many of the facilities people on this call know, if you don't actively change the schedule, the heating systems will keep on running even though nobody's there. So we were able to dramatically decrease our natural gas use during the lockdown, and that was for big emphasis. So we may have some data for that the Claire Lilienthal School for the few months that they were occupied. And so if you email conserve at sfusd.edu and you email Amy, you could see if she's able to pull up that data.
Okay.
Before I
great.
left, we did not get to troubleshoot. So I do not know what, and I'm super curious whether or not we were able to reduce the, whether we're able to meet our energy use target of 20 kBTUs per square foot per year. So if you
Yeah.
could CC my work email when you do that.
Okay. So
I'd
that's
love to
still
see-
active, Nick, your work email.
Yeah, it's still active. I'm on leave.
Cool.
I'm not gone entirely. Yeah.
Cool. All right. And then, so quick follow-up to that. Did you install or find out, you know, this, since this whole shutdown happened, there's been this huge push, and again, actually money coming down the road to look at assessing ventilation and filtration. Do you recall when you did those modernizations, whether you installed new ventilation in concert with the heat
We did
pump?
not. Yeah, we did not do that at most schools. I mean, obviously for new schools, we are obliged to, but I think that our bond staff decided against that. I'm remembering some project details where I do remember it being part of the project. I can't remember why. In some cases we did, in some cases we didn't.
Okay.
So
maybe we'll follow up offline because I don't want to take other people's time. But so great to see you and hear you again. And I know where you're at, so I will connect with you offline. But again, thanks for the presentation.
Sounds good. Good to hear you, Alice.
Great. Thank you, Alice. All right. So we have another question from the Q&A, which is, how much do students and teachers have to modify their behavior in reaching these goals?
Glad you brought that up. When we finished the Clear Lilienthal School, that was at the bottom right on one of those slides, I organized a walkthrough for students and staff. And before conducting that walkthrough, we put up a whole bunch of signage that explained the energy features of the building. And then essentially I walked around with the students and explained what those signs mean and how they can personally be involved to reduce the energy use of the building. So we explained why shades exist, when should they be up, when should they be down. We reminded them to turn off lights. We looked at zero waste features too. We put in some bottle fillers in those schools and reminded students to bring their water bottle, their reusable water bottles. We also had a note about the fact that now that buildings are so efficient, the biggest energy user in a school, even in San Francisco where commutes are pretty short, is actually the energy used to get to school. So reminding students to focus on non-car commutes as part of the bigger zero carbon picture. So I think students and staff are extremely critical. I think in terms of making the big savings, the best bang for your buck is to actually upgrade the systems in your buildings and to have backup systems like motion sensors, so that even if the students do forget to turn off the light, they will go off by themselves. But I think it'd be a missed opportunity if we didn't explain to our students why we're designing the buildings the way we are, so they can understand the logic behind the building they're in, and they can appreciate that the school district is doing something for their future.
Yeah, definitely. Is there any difficulty with like the teachers getting them on board or having that education go through them, or?
I wanted to do it myself because I like to get a little wonky with the kids on the building tech. But there are many organizations that, like programs that allow students to learn about energy use in their schools or to take trips in their local communities to natural areas, et cetera. So I think while we didn't do that to educate our students about our zero carbon plans, that is definitely a way that teachers can integrate environmental education into the curriculum. And I have rarely found teachers to not want to do that. I mean, a lot of our teachers sign up for stuff even before I joined the school district. So
great, that's wonderful to hear. All right, so we've got another question. What role does the State Architect Division play in supporting and motivating school facilities moving to zero carbon?
They should play an incredible role. And recently, the Division of the State Architect, or DSA as we call it internally, launched a program, a zero net energy, what do they call it? Not collaborator, but when you get a bunch of people together, they're all working on a problem. I'm blanking now. But they got a bunch of school districts together that basically want to explore zero net energy and zero net carbon strategies, and they're going to walk through with them, developing their own plans, implementing the right documents like the ones that I shared with you today, and then executing on those documents over the course of, I think, a year, maybe a little bit longer. So I think that is exactly the role that DSA needs to play, and hopefully this program will continue with another cohort of school districts when they're done with the first cohort. Because I think a lot of big school districts might have the ability to pay for a sustainability director or department to work on these issues, but small districts often don't. In a small district, you might have one facilities manager who runs the facilities division and has a few staff to repair things. But if they want to design a new building, they go to outside architects. If they want to use bonds to build a new building, they hire outside firms, outside construction firms to do that. They don't have in-house capabilities. So DSA can really support in that way by helping to provide some resources that these schools wouldn't normally have, and or to provide some funding, to provide some time for somebody to take out of their day to draft that plan that is needed so that they can hand off that plan to the architects and the contractors they deal with so it can really be executed. So I think DSA plays kind of an enabling function for school districts that don't have the financial wherewithal. And I think that's exactly the kind of equity role that the state should be playing.
Great, thank you for answering that. Our next question is, how can homeowners adopt some of the approaches you've spoken about in schools, given that financing is often a major challenge?
Yes. Well, one thing is, if you are remodeling, which is probably not the thrust of this question, since if you're remodeling, financing is probably not a problem for you. But if you are remodeling, just like when SFUSD remodels, make sure that you electrify your building, because if you've got walls open or a contractor there anyway, and an electrician who can upgrade your electrical system, those are the kinds of things you need to take advantage of so that the cost of going all electric is less, because you already got the right people in the room. In terms of what do you do if you're not remodeling, but you want to start making some changes? I think one of the things that the state is really lacking is incentives for homeowners. There used to be a program called Energy, I think it's called Energy Efficient California, or it was basically an incentive program for remodeling. And I think we got, when I remodeled my house, I think we got like $12,000 to help make our house more efficient. So basically the contractor would just submit some invoices or some work orders to show that they had done work that was aligned with the state's goals. Unfortunately, last time I checked, there was no money associated with that program. It's just an awareness campaign. And I think one of the things California really needs to do is to throw money at this problem again, provide incentives for homeowners to replace their electric panels so that when their hot water heater breaks, they can get an electric heat pump. Or if their furnace dies, they could put in a heat pump. But these things need to be incentivized, especially in the early phase, because a lot of people either won't know that that's a technology they should be adopting, or they're afraid of the first, or contractors don't feel like there's a reason to do it. But maybe if part of that incentive actually goes to the contractor, you can start to shift the conversation. So I would say for the person who asked the question, one of the first things you should do is look up the Energy Commission's heat pump hot water heater program, which just to kind of figure out when that's going to go live, because I think the state is going to start by trying to get people to replace their natural gas water heaters when the time comes. So that would be kind of your first point of entry into the world of electrification.
Gotcha. Great. Thank you for sharing that. I'm sure that's super helpful. Another question that we have is, are you considering using passive heating technology?
When the orientation works for us, I think I heard you say passive. When the orientation works for us, definitely. In fact, we had one, so usually the orientation doesn't work for us is the problem. Passive technologies, for those of you that are new to the space, just mean that we use the sun to heat up our buildings. Generally speaking, the way you do that is you have your building facing south, or the long side of the building facing south, with an overhang, so that the summer sun is blocked by the overhang and doesn't get in the windows, but the winter sun can shine underneath the overhang and warm up your building. In practice, it's not as practical as one would think, because most teachers and students don't like to write with the sun shining in their eyes in the winter. So what do? They put down their shades. So relying on passive strategies is a beautiful concept, but we found it's a little technical, it's difficult in practice. So one really cool technology I'm excited about is something called thermochromic glazing. And thermochromic just means heat changing. It's a window film that will darken when the sun hits the windows and lighten when the sun doesn't, kind of like those glasses that people sometimes choose to wear. And the really cool thing about it is that in the winter, when the sun hits your window, it automatically dims, which means that the glare disappears, and teachers and students are not encouraged to lower the blinds because they still feel comfortable in the classroom. But as soon as that sun moves on to a different part of the sky, the window becomes brighter again, which means the lights, which are nowadays usually controlled by photosensors, can turn off again as the windows allow more of the natural light in without the glare. So this is an example of it's high tech in the sense that most people's windows don't tint, but it's low tech because unlike the windows that you can control with a remote that can be turned dark or light with a touch of a button, this is totally passive. So there's nothing that can break. It's just going to keep doing its thing for 20, 30 years. There's no maintenance required. There's no electrical connections, nothing. It just does it on its own, just like your glasses. So it's a great technology to allow the passive strategies that in theory should help us a lot, but in practice sometimes don't work as we envision.
Great, that's super interesting. I had no idea about those windows. Thanks for sharing that. So we've only got about 3-4 minutes left, so I'll just do 1 or 2 final questions and then we can wrap it up. But our next question is, do the existing redesigns of buildings or new designs of new buildings include water harvesting and using for irrigation, having gardens, having compost, etc., so that this teaches students about sustainability?
Yes. Basically, the slide that I skipped over that showed our entire board resolution on this topic has a bunch of items related to water use. For example, our goal is to reduce our water use by 50% by 2030, and to increasingly meet our needs with rainwater harvesting. We've also got a big green schoolyard program, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but if you go to that same sfusd.edu/sustainability site, you will see a section on water, and I think we call it water resilience, which is about reducing our water usage, but also improving our stormwater management. So you'll read about some of our programs on that website.
Wonderful, thank you. And for the last question here, we have a question about cities and school districts and asking if there's any way that they can partner together on building and transportation decarbonization, even though they are often separate and maybe isolated from each other.
I think it depends on the willingness of the city to participate. I think the city always has, it's very hard. A city can always spend money on a school district, but a school district cannot spend money on city work. So, for example, we can't just start putting electric vehicle chargers on sidewalks as a school district, but the city can definitely choose to do that. But a city, on the flip side, could decide to support EV charging for our fleet if they chose to. So I think the lesson here is that school districts and cities should partner on these efforts, because schools, as part of the city, obviously have a role to play in allowing the city to meet its greenhouse gas reduction goals. So in our case, I have a very tight connection with the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, which is our utility company for water and electricity. And they are very supportive of our electrification goals, because it means that we are going to be paying less money to one utility and paying more money to them. So it's in their own best interest to help us. We also work with our Department of the Environment. Some cities have sustainability departments. And obviously they're happy when we reduce our trash usage because it helps them to meet their goals for trash reduction. So I think the key is to reach out to city departments that have an interest in becoming greener, meeting their climate change goals, and seeing how the work you do interests them and whether they can help finance or at least provide resources so that you can be successful.
Great, thank you for answering that final question. This was super informative and helpful. And obviously, based on the questions, I think people got a lot of really great information from you. So thank you so much again, and I will pass it off to Doug to wrap us up for this event.
Thank you, Emma. We'd like to remind everyone one last time to please fill out your evaluation. The link is in the chat and will also be emailed to attendees who registered over Eventbrite. Once again, very big thanks to Kaushik Toda and Nik Kaestner, and of course to our audience for taking time to attend this event. Thank you very much and have a good day.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day.